Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, Beyond the Book. This is a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how we play them. I'm your host, Troy. Joining me is my co-host, Max, and with us behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about miniature agnostic games. These are games that give you the ability to play new games with your old or really any models you may have.
Yeah, and this is a broad topic.
It is.
For sure.
Oh, yeah.
It's strange to say it's not the most popular games that exist, but it is the majority of titles that I can think of are miniature agnostic, mostly because for the same reason that there are so many role-playing games out there, you can just write up a rule set and use whatever miniatures you have to design it and just assume that the other person can do the same thing when they play it.
Absolutely. There's a low barrier to entry to both playing a miniature agnostics game and writing one in many regards, because the tools available to you are whatever models from whatever manufacturer you want to use. With the rise of 3D printing and independent 3D sculptors and all the STLs out there, you can do very bespoke, custom things with these games. Or you can take some of the bigger budget manufacturers out there. You can buy their models right off the shelves and just apply them to these other, sometimes more indie rule sets.
For the longest time, when we've had miniature games, from going way back into the day, into the 70s, I would say that most games were miniature agnostic. The models were not always, like Airfix and stuff like that, weren't really designed specifically for game pieces. So really, this is the traditional way of playing.
Yeah, that's true.
So the idea of having a dedicated line is a much more modern idea that starts to kind of come out of, I'm trying to think of like exactly where that begins. They must be dedicated lines prior to things like TSR and Games Workshop, or at least the notion of using miniatures in that way. But I do know that when you're coming out of the Hex Encounter games, which don't use miniatures at all, and you're starting to do the more free represented sand table style games, you really just took whatever you had.
Yeah, 100%. Like there were 54 millimeter toy soldiers, painted and used as gaming pieces. There were all types of different stand-ins that have come to be replaced with commercially available, bespoke, dedicated game pieces. And it's kind of cool that there's this almost like circle hooking back around, in that now there's all these miniature agnostic games. Once again, you can use different pieces to achieve the model requirements of all these games. But let's talk a little bit about some of the different ways you can go about it. One of the most obvious things you can do is you could buy a Warhammer 40,000 model and use it as is and apply it to a different sci-fi game or a different fantasy game of your choice.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like, until you can do that, you may not realize you can do that. It's totally obvious once you get your head outside of the idea that these models and these rules belong to each other. But once you do, there's a lot of really flexible arrangements you can make with these new guys. And kind of a debate with miniature agnostic gaming is like, if you're buying, say, Games Workshop models to use in independent games that you want to play, do you worry about how you build and paint them in such a way as to keep them compatible with the original intended game system? Or do you just go totally freeform and make them into whatever you want and paint them green? You know what I'm saying? Like,
there's a flip side to that too, which is how much does the way a model looks, how much does it look in the game that is not the game it was built for, kind of affect your immersion in playing it? Can you ignore the fact that that's a Space Marine?
Well, that's a real question. Like, I love the Northstar military figures, that the plastic kits they make, and the Frostgrave models, their sci-fi range of multi-part plastic, I use for lots of indie sci-fi games just for that very point, because they don't look like 40K.
Right, yeah. So, there you go. That's like a perfect example of where you might think otherwise. And maybe, yeah, you might buy Games Workshop miniatures, but you might assemble and paint them in a way that's specifically for a more generic style of play, or even more so custom specifically to a models agnostic game that you might want to be playing.
And a different way to go about that is you can use the popular term kitbashing, where you're taking different models that are not like meant to be assembled together, but you are assembling them together, taking, you know, an arm from this kit, a head from this kit, and a body from this kit to create a new unique combination of parts. And doing that with some of the more like dedicated imagery of like 40K, but breaking some of those rules and mixing parts can allow you to use those really cool models, but get away from them looking like a Dark Angel that's now in my universe. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that's effectively what I ended up doing for my Space Weirdos figures, is that I found a bunch of secondhand Warhammer 40K stuff, and then I started kind of snipping, and there was a bunch of other things mixed in there. So I mixed in some Age of Sigmar heads, and I had a bunch of, my friend gave me a bunch of old Warzone, and I just started kind of gluing and selectively putting things together. One thing that ends up happening with that, though, and this will kind of get us into our next point, is that you end up with very distinctive and exaggerated characters. It's very hard to make well, I don't say it's hard, but you're more inclined to make unique characters when you do this rather than uniformed units.
Okay, I see exactly what you mean.
Yeah. Because I made them for Space Weirdos, that makes sense, because then I can stat them as like unique, like special units. But I also have some of them that are just as is. So I have effectively bog standard Space Marines and troopers from Warzone built as is, but then I also have these conglomerations with a bunch of like random other kit pieces. And usually that's like your boss character, or some kind of big bad or a monster or something like that you can throw onto the table. But then that is kind of plays into the idea that a lot of these, not all of them, strangely, but most of the time, most miniature agnostic games are very customizable in how they define units. So they'll either do this in a really general sense, where like that's just an infantry guy no matter what he is, and in some cases we go to the idea of WYSIWYG.
Yes.
Which is an acronym for what you see is what you get. That being, in this case, whatever rules apply are probably based on what the model suggests it has. And like when we were talking about Hobgoblin last episode, that's a game that works in a WYSIWYG fashion. You are dealing with like grouped units. So it matters a little less. You know, it's not a skirmish game per se, where like each individual might count really specifically, but you can suggest certain things by using certain units in certain groups or certain models in a unit.
Like in Hobgoblin, if you say they're like cavalry, they have to be like cavalry. They don't have to be riding horses per se. They could be centaur men, whatever.
Yeah.
But there has to be a correlation to what you say they are. And that applies to a skirmish game all the way down to like if you're playing Necromunda, like if you say that guy's got an autogun, he's got an autogun. And that's a very specific way to interpret the miniatures game. And that tends to be a skirmish level thing. But when you get up into the higher, more abstract games, you still do need to have things mean what you say they mean. I mean, we could just use construction paper cut out into rectangles and triangles in different colors and color code everything, but that's missing the point of a miniatures game entirely, in my opinion.
Yeah, and different games, in some sense, have their own traditions of how they handle different aspects of where do you get your models and what kind of models you use. A unique example of this, though Catalyst Game Labs will tell you otherwise, is BattleTech has pretty much always had the tradition of anything could be a mech. Famously, the original book, including the very first Battle Droids edition, had little cardboard cutout standees that you could make. that just had like a picture of a mech on it. And those were considered legitimate. And pretty much every version of the rules, possibly, I don't know that I've looked for this specifically, but even in the most recent edition might include this, is that in BattleTech tradition, you can use anything as long as you can identify it from something else.
Yeah.
Like you can take a collection of jelly beans, and then that color combination is a mech. Or you can just, draw bits on a cocktail napkin and have a hex grid for some reason. I don't know.
But I mean, take a look at this. Like, there are games that are no longer in production. And with these games, they've kind of transformed to miniature agnostic games in a certain sense, right? Like, it's interesting that some games have a tradition of that coming from their origin. But a game like Mordheim started with a bespoke model line. And then as it went out of production and left print, people kept playing the game because it's a fun game. But they had to source historical models or alternative fantasy models, from other companies, or using, kitbashes from different things, to mix some Warhammer Empire parts with some Renaissance historical parts or whatever you're doing, right? But it would be a community decision as they move to more like their own moderation of what's going to count for the right things.
Yeah. A weird kind of flip side to that is, and there isn't a huge community of this, but it must be a dedicated one, I assume, are the people that still play Warzone.
Oh, yeah.
Where there isn't any models being produced for this, but now due to 3D printing, they are making their own, which are basically copies of the original one.
Right. So they've kind of like brought the style of model, the aesthetic and the art style back through their own production.
Yeah.
Like kind of cottage industry style.
Yeah, it's almost like self-produced, but it's still using the original manufactured models as the basis.
Right.
Whereas with Mordheim, it's more about cannibalizing Warhammer fantasy models and generic fantasy models to then make whatever unit you want, and then you justify based on the rules and the community. And yeah, I mean, people are still doing... I mean, I imagine now with the new Warhammer Fantasy line coming out, there's now more things for Mordheim players to buy.
Yeah.
Strangely. There's like a weird secondary market because, yeah, I don't have to make these blocked out mass battle units. I can literally just take one of those guys, make them look unique, and then that's part of my warband.
Yeah, 100%. And with Empire of Man around the corner for the old world, there will be a lot of parts back on the menu for Mordheim players to make their warbands. The one unit that I have missed for so many years that never made the jump from Fantasy Battles to Age of Sigmar is Empire Militia. And that's like the box for playing Mordheim, in my opinion. So when Empire of Man comes back around, if that box hits the street again, 2 of those, I mean, it's more than you need, but 2 of those, you could build like 3 super custom Mordheim warbands. You get a Reichland, a Middenheim, and then who's the third one? I'm forgetting. The nautical guys. But you could get them. And you'd be able to have like such good campaigns with all of that. And it would be all just out of those kits. And then those same models could slide to other skirmish games, to other miniature agnostic games that you could use them in. And heck, you could even use them in like a pirate game or certain periods of historical games, There's lots of things you can do. And I think that's the key when you're talking about miniature agnostic gaming in general, is that like you kind of have to be the creative genesis of your ideas, but that's the only thing stopping you. Like, you can go anywhere. Like, okay, I want to give a couple examples now, though, just to kind of like give people ideas of like, if you wanted to do this, what could you do? But one of the popular ones that I really like is called Rain in Hell.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a cool one because it seems obvious you could use Games Workshop models, but there are so many conversions and kitbashes you can do to make these demonic beasts, these like devils. And it's a skirmish game. It plays fast. It's got a simple campaign system. So there's lots of cool things about it. But it's more the neat thematic things that you can do to meet like the Hellfire theme. You know what I mean? But you can get like the Frostgrave kit from Northstar military figures we're talking about again. They've got a demon kit that is really cool with like cloven hooves and horns and like wicked kind of, to use an Elder Scrolls term, kind of Daedric looking weapons. You know what I'm saying? It's really neat. And that would all go perfect for Rain and Hell. And that's just you as a gamer looking at the stuff you want, picking the spikiest guys out there, and then there you go. You've got a Rain and Hell warband. It's on Wargame Vault, so it's super easy to get your grip on. And you could get playing, like many miniature agnostic games, with like 10 models aside.
Oh, for sure. It's a lot of these games are very economic or at least scalable as such. I think some of them might play a little bit better in that sense. One thing that I liked about Rain and Hell in regards to it being a model agnostic game is that it caters to a particular kind of miniature that you've got.
That's actually a good point.
Which is the biggest, ugliest things you have.
That's really funny.
And you don't even have to kitbash necessarily, but that you could. There's some suggestion that you might be able to do that.
Yeah.
A really weird one is it's the Morkborg spin-off.
Oh, Forbidden Psalm.
Forbidden Psalm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of like Rain in Hell, but less hell and more just sort of Morkbori, or I've forgotten the specific way you're supposed to pronounce it, but that setting's sort of bleak pre-apocalypse tone.
Yeah, like the clock is about to strike midnight and you're playing a miniatures game in that exact moment, probably doing awful things because the campaigns of that game are wild. But yeah, it's a really cool, like it kind of falls into this RPG light skirmish mold.
Yeah.
Where there's a couple other games in that mold that I really enjoy, but you have a warband or a company or a party and they progress and change. And part of the fun of that is picking the models from wherever you source them to be these characters that stand out and live large. Like in Forbidden Psalm, you would be using whatever type of, I would say, exaggerated fantasy characters you wanted to use. So it could be anything from the Warhammer range. There's a ton of other fantasy ranges and STLs that would work really well for that. If you wanted to perhaps play something like 5 Leagues from the Borderlands, that's more of a low fantasy game. It's a little like kind of gritty medieval feeling. And in that game, you'd be able to repurpose a lot of historical models. Like you could go to Wargames Atlantic and get some of their new medieval kits, like their peasant kit. It gives you like 18 to 20 peasants. That would give you like so many different types of opposition that your RPG warband runs into in 5 Leagues could be covered by those guys.
Mm-hmm.
And then those same peasants in a different game could be doing something else. And depending how you base them, if you put them on square bases, you can still rank them up. If you put them on circle bases, they're maybe more committed to skirmish unless you have a sabo tray for them, or you don't mind them just being clustered in such a way. But it's really interesting that, like, this is something else I wanted to bring up, that historical models and historical games have an interesting relationship to the term miniature agnostic.
Yeah.
Because most historical games aren't made with a miniature line in mind. I mean, the most popular ones are, much like sci-fi and fantasy, like if we're talking Warlord Games, right, with bolt action and black powder, because they have custom ranges of models that are like some of the best around, perhaps. But the game is designed around selling you those models and creating that ecosystem. Same with Battlefront miniatures for 15 mil and Flames of War, right? Like there's a lot of 15 mil World War II out there. You don't need their Flames of War stuff. But the way that they make the cards come in the box and the box comes with the stuff that fits the way they organize the units, like they're really trying to make that click together in such a way as to just make it a one-stop shop for you. And that's, I would say, abnormal for a historical game. Whereas, not that there's a better way to do it per se, but some of the other historical games I've been drawn to more passionately are just the game. and there isn't an associated model range, and you source the historical models that you like best and can find at the best criteria for yourself, whether that's price, quality, quantity, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, from at least my own experience, most of the companies that make non-bespoke models make historics for the most part. Fantasy's been a bit more popular lately, probably because of the uptick in D&D, and so having custom miniatures for that. 3D printing obviously accelerating the availability of producers. You're typically going to find most established manufacturers that don't sell a rule system, though a lot of them sometimes do anyway. We'll say they're miniature forward companies, usually just sell a whole bunch of different historics. I don't know if they necessarily produce them all, but there's this interesting idea that, like, yeah, with Warlord Games and Osprey, they basically sell to a line, don't they?
Well, it's kind of interesting because Osprey has, for historical, Osprey is partnered with Warlord for the purposes of bolt action, right? But when we're looking at Osprey for fantasy and sci-fi, they've got Frostgrave, Stargrave, they've got a few other big ones. But Frostgrave and Stargrave, as we've already mentioned, do have their own models. So they come with models you can buy for these games. But they're also very specific in that you do not need those models. You know, you can use anything you have, historical, fantasy, or otherwise, to play these games. But here is a line of models that's very well developed for the game specifically, if you wanted that. So it's kind of like you could go either way. And when it comes to a game like Frostgrave or Stargrave, it's really nice. You can use all these different parts because there's a lot of combinations of character builds. And I would say that the model lines that you buy for Frostgrave and Stargrave don't give you everything that you could build. Like in Stargrave, you can make some pretty gnarly melee builds, but none of the Stargrave models are really equipped that way. They're more equipped like sort of a dirt side sci-fi vibe with like pistols and rifles. They don't really have like chainswords, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
But you could definitely get those weapons in a game like Stargrave. So it's kind of like, what's going on with that? So I guess I do have to go to a different source to find that guy. And that's actually something else that's kind of interesting is like when there's a company like, say, GW, right, Games Workshop, and they're selling you the Horus Heresy, and there are core units that are not manufactured by them, what do you do? Where do you source those? How do you go about that? Are you expected to kitbash every one of them? Do you go third party? Like it's interesting, like even games that are not miniature agnostic games may have elements of them that push you into using models from different sources. Not that that's bad or anything. I don't mean to use push in a negative way, but like to source everything you need, sometimes you're going to have to go outside the lines because think about BattleTech, right? If you want to play a BattleTech game and you want infantry, you want a range of light wheeled vehicles, those aren't in production by Catalyst at all.
Oh, yeah. And any kind of support stuff that might even be listed in the rules, Catalyst doesn't really. There are lots of people, lots of companies that provide those units. And I don't know, like Troy and I joke that BattleTech is secretly like a 6 mil war game.
Yeah.
It just uses big, stompy robots that look, that dominate the battlefield. And so that kind of throws that off. But you can always just buy 6 mil sci-fi. That is a popular combination of words.
Yeah.
If you're going to look for certainly in the 6 mil range, that's definitely something you can figure out. And then how do you paint them up to look like different houses and different factions or clans? It's really up to it's really up to you. I think the smallest unit that Catalyst puts out, I think, are probably the Elementals.
Yeah, it's Elementals and Battle Armor, the IS Battle Armor too, that just came out.
Oh, yeah. So they have Battle Armor now. Elementals are a kind of battle.
So it's kind of like, yeah, that's basically as tiny as it gets from Catalyst. And the models are great. Like, they're great sculpts.
They're a little big. That's just in my opinion, based on my understanding of the lore.
Oh, yeah.
They're not far off, but they're kind of built into a little cluster. I think some of them are jump jetting.
Yeah, they are.
It's a cool pose, but they're scaled to the actual mechs. They seem a little large.
Yeah, I know what you mean, actually. That's a good point.
Yeah, they're almost more like proto mechs.
Yeah, exactly. Weird thing.
For a deep cut for all you BattleTech heads out there.
Yeah, right. Thinking about proto mechs. But another interesting game that I kind of want to mention, talking about these sci-fi games, is Grunts. That's kind of an older game now, but it's a 15 mil sci-fi game. And in 15 mil sci-fi, there are like thousands of models available. You can go to so many different lead slingers. You know what I mean? Like these caster companies that are still making metal models.
With the sketchiest looking websites that you're not even sure if you're going to get it.
Yeah, I know. But you're like, can I put my credit card into this website? Is this okay?
Does this go nowhere? Am I going to get something?
Like that's such a thing. But Grunts is a really cool game. It's definitely on the harder side of sci-fi, not in terms of difficulty, but I mean like thematically it's a hard sci-fi game, but it's really cool. And it's very much about building your own armies again. And that's something a lot of miniature agnostic games do. Like we talked about with Hobgoblin in the previous week, they'll give you tools, sometimes better tools, sometimes worse tools, but they'll give you tools to make your own units out of the models you already have. Like, to talk about another Nordic Weasel game, because we talked about their partnership with Modifius over 5 leagues from the Borderlands. But another one that they do is Laser Storm. That's a 6 mil sci-fi game. And you get to make everything about your units. It's very detailed in how creative you can be with your units. And it's really neat because you could find these 6 mil, maybe 15 mil if you want to up the gamut of that game perhaps, but you can find a lot of these different manufacturers making so many cool things. So it's really neat that you get to go in and make them valid and make them real for your game, you know? Those sci-fi games are really fun for that. I think sci-fi games with like their tinkering mentality of like, you know, putting different weapon systems on, changing armor values. They're really fun to just like lose yourself in the army list creation process, especially miniature agnostic games, when you can speculate like, I wonder what model would be cool to use for my heavy tank. And how would I make that heavy tank? And if I chose this model, would it be a laser or a fusion gun or a, you know, like I just really enjoy that whole losing yourself into the nuts and bolts of it all. And again, that's a big miniature agnostic thing. And you don't need to do a big battle game to have that, right? Like we were talking about sword weirdos and space weirdos. You really get into the nuts and bolts of your individuals and customize a character, make them interesting. Another game that's a lot like that, not to compare it like it's a clone or something, but I would say Shoot People in Space, another Nordic Weasel game, it's a super laser burn feeling game, right?
It's a better version of, it's like a revamp of Laser Burn, but with ultimately better base mechanics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not base as in like formulated like ground base, but like the dice system makes a lot more sense.
Absolutely. And it's got this like really fun way that you can put together these custom characters that are they're not just officers in a military. They're more personalized. You know, like you can have a military officer for sure. But if you wanted more of a scoundrel or a rogue or a mystic, you could easily do that as well. And the game really encourages you to get in on that. And that's part of the fun of the miniature agnostic game as well, is like really writing the list, and not writing the list in the same way as having the official app, getting the latest point values, assembling to a preset score for you and your opponent's next matched game. It's not quite like that. There's a lot more of like this narrative sense of you defining the logic of this army. Like why do they have this? And why does that matter to me? And why do I like that model? And making sure to include it. Like you kind of create the story in your mind of the warband, or if we're talking about Laser Storm again, of the whole army, you know. And it's like write your own order of battle, you know, and that's like nerdy as hell, but I really like doing that. So it's really good when you get into these games that give you that. Now, I did want to also talk about some games that are like, they started as miniature agnostic games, but they're kind of not as much anymore. And I think the two that I would talk about for that would be One Page Rules and Kings of War would be two that I would bring up for that, because both of them came out of effectively being like alternatives to Games Workshop in some respects. So they were sort of based on being their own rule set, but you using different models. But they've over time, Kings of War through Mantic, of course, most obviously, but made their own models and kind of developed their own bespoke lines. Like nowadays with one-page rules, you can STL basically all of the factions in there and not need to use anyone else's models anymore. You could kind of go totally house with their stuff.
It's interesting that they kind of evolved back into creating an established system of units. I mean, it's not established. The rules still support basically you can play anything. I mean, for anyone that doesn't know, I guess the principle of one-page rules is kind of, it's GW sort of esque back to basics rules.
Yes.
In my opinion, they're a little too basic, but they have their advantages for sure in the play. And it really sort of suggests the idea of like a different way to play with your GW stuff, like with your Citadel minis. It's interesting that they're now like, oh yeah, and because I have seen lines that are like leaned toward using like for Grimdark Future and stuff like that, and I'm like, oh, okay. But then you think, oh, that could work the other way too, so long as you're not like in a tournament. But I could fill in some ranks on my my Warhammer stuff if I use these generics. I know that's a taboo subject. I mean, using the wrong kind of paint can be a taboo subject with some people. But
well, that's kind of, yes, I know. Did you paint that with contrast? But
yeah, right.
So it's like, it's funny, but where my personal gaming is gone because of the constraints of life and time and money and resource and all this stuff, I want to be able to tell stories. That's the main thing I want. So I want to focus my choices around that. And the best storytelling games, in many respects to me, tend to come from the developers and designers that are not burdened by huge settings or obligations to pre-existing model ranges. So when you want to tell these really interesting stories and kind of like look at your gaming as almost like sharing an aspect of journaling, these miniature agnostic games just crash right in there and can really give you that.
Right.
You know what I'm trying to say?
For sure, yeah. I think just as like to point out like another really novel example of a miniatures agnostic game using something that we would recognize as something that could be used on a table but isn't necessarily is Gaslands.
Oh, right on, yeah.
So this is a Carmageddon style demolition derby. Car Wars, I guess, is its predecessor, or it's, the thing that it's probably modeled partly after. It basically encourages you to kit bash with Hot Wheels.
Yeah.
For lack of a better term. Or just like toy cars. And like if you go to a dollar store, you're probably able to find some kind, like if you go to the toy section, you can find like not super high quality, but if you're going to be gluing stuff to it, who cares? But like pretty decent car models.
Yeah.
And if you buy them all within the same manufacturer, they're probably going to be scaled to each other. I love the idea of just taking like random bits from your other kits and then just gluing them to a car. And it's like, oh yeah, that's got a rocket launcher. That's got like a flamethrower. It's
like opening up the idea of a miniatures agnostic game to being like a components agnostic game where it's like you can use anything. It's not even a miniature anymore. It's like whatever you want.
Yeah.
And that's super cool because it's like a problem that miniature gaming has is that it has a really high entry point. Like it's hard to know if you even like this hobby. You know what I mean? To even get into it. Like you kind of need an on-ramp. And it's almost like Gaslands is one of the coolest on-ramps to this hobby because you're not needing to buy into a subscription style ecosystem from a big publisher. You're not needing to have, really cool shelves of models to be able to pull your random dice encounters from. It's just like, no, you need like 6 to 12 Hot Wheels with orc guns glued to the sides of them, and you're ready to rock. And that is just like a really neat way to get people into the hobby, I think. And it's another thing these miniature agnostic games do really well is they just kind of lower that entry point a little bit. It's kind of a mistake, though, that some people make, I've made, with looking at rules light RPGs and thinking that's a better way into a role-playing game, when instead sometimes they actually, by being rules light, offload to the player and GM a lot of the rules decisioning. You know what I mean? Because you have to fill in all those blanks now.
Yeah.
And it's like miniature agnostic games can also do that in a wargaming sense, where you now need to source all this stuff. And it's on you now to be able to make this game play. There's not like a box set that you can buy. Like, say, some of the other manufacturers out there that will sell you a pick up and play scenario. Some of these games, you have to download a PDF. And then you have to decide on the models you want. And then you're ordering them from different places or buying them at different storefronts. And you know what I mean? Like, you kind of have to go through a bit more of a process in that respect. But it does lower the ceiling in that you don't need 2,000 points. And again, I like a good 2,000 point game. I'm in a league right now and it's a lot of fun. But it's really cool when I can just pick the 10 guys that I like to play a cool skirmish game and I'm off to the races.
I think having those different levels of entry is important to get new people in, and also having it so that, like, for me, I was, until I met you, Troy, I wasn't really that big of a miniatures guy. I didn't quite get it, but being introduced to games that kind of had this flexibility and getting basically a bunch of random minis and kind of playing around and kitbashing them and seeing what fun stuff I could make out of them was a good way to get me into it, because I like games and I like art stuff, but it's not always the easiest thing to connect those together without having this huge investment. And the idea of buying these prefabricated pieces that only work in this one game, and then you're committed into that ecosystem, and that's a big sell because you don't know if you're really going to like it. I mean, for the most part, I'm glad that most Games Workshop stores hold events to try to get people to play their new games. And there are obviously hobby and game clubs. I'm part of one here in Vancouver, and that have people demoing stuff like once a month. You can come in and do an event. And that's a good little show and tell. But if you don't have that, you don't know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
And you don't know if you want to. And all you can see is that it looks really expensive and not very flexible.
What kind of gets left out in all this is a bit of a diversion, so pardon me, but like, we also forget that terrain's a factor in all this too. And that's kind of the silent killer of the miniature wargaming world.
Oh, yeah.
Is like, oh man, I got my army of 10 guys and I painted them and I feel so great and I'm ready to play my first game on a kitchen table with a textbook as a hill. And it's like,
oh yeah, that kills me.
I know it's another really challenging part of the hobby again. And that's something that's slowly becoming less agnostic in the hobby is terrain, because the big manufacturers are now more and more selling you terrain. And that's not necessarily bad, because terrain looking good is awesome, but it is kind of like further siloing everything off in a weird way.
A little bit, yeah.
Like, that's why I really like the Gale Force 9 Battlefield in the Box stuff, because it's kind of like the miniature agnostic version of terrain, where it's like you can get their ruined village scenery, and that could be Middle-earth strategy battle game. That could be Warhammer the Old World. That could do a lot of different things, because it's just kind of fantasy ruins. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like a way to do that, a sort of a terrain approach that's agnostic, as opposed to like getting really, really perhaps well made, but definitely expensive setting specific plastic terrain, right? That's got like Aquilas on it and shit.
Again, coming from more of like the art focused side of things, I actually like terrain a bit more. I'm looking forward to having more space when I'll be moving soon and getting some more space to do things, but I'm actually looking forward to building terrain, because it has that, you can add that personal touch. But you're right, it is a commitment. But I think to the right person, terrain is a bit of a blessing, because it isn't necessarily, not to say that painting minis is a paint by numbers thing. There's always, again, kit bashing and individual paint schemes and adding distinction. There's a lot of fun in doing that.
Yeah.
And it's also a very like meditative process. But terrain can be really interesting for somebody that just likes making stuff out of stuff.
Yeah, it's the most crafty.
There's a lot of fun you can do with just a big box of popsicle sticks.
100%. Like cardboard tubes and foam. People have made amazing things with that. Like, yes, the plastic components you can get for all these different games are gorgeous, but what you can also assemble yourself can be just as valuable if you put the time into it.
Yeah. And just a if anyone has been curious about this but hasn't looked into it, not that you can't get well-scaled model train sets that fit with 16 mil or 28 mil, though there are some discrepancies that don't quite add up on that because it's a different hobby. They are way too expensive. It is actually a lot cheaper to just find a miniatures manufacturer that makes a cheaper version of like railroad tracks for your Western game.
Oh, yeah.
Unless you already have it and you're into model railroads and all that. Oh, the conversion is not cost effective.
Yeah, totally.
A friend of mine and I went down a little rabbit hole to try to figure out like how that would work, and we're just like, no, that's crazy. Not at all worth it. So here's a question that I'm gonna kind of put to you, and this will flip it onto the other side of this thing.
Okay.
What is your feeling and opinion of the use of miniatures in role-playing games?
Oh, that's interesting. Because like a role-playing game could be a way to think about another miniature agnostic game, because like basically none of them have bespoke models made for them aside from Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
But I am a theater of the mind guy.
Yeah.
I can respect that models allow for relational information to each other. You can do really exciting set pieces. There's a lot of value to it, and I won't deny that. But for me, the exact reason I would go to an RPG is all the things that a miniature can't do.
Mm-hmm.
And to put a miniature down in an RPG is, in my opinion, to constrain that RPG to a miniatures game. And again, as like a miniatures gamer, first and foremost, I'm there for that. I want that. But then miniatures games are doing that better than RPG rules for the purposes of the moving, the fighting, the shooting, the etc. for your little men. So it's like when I'm in an RPG, I don't really want to get miniatures mixed in. Worlds colliding, Jerry.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's funny because there's always been that tradition of it, but there's so many complications for me that are suggested by doing that, especially with, say, so we'll take a classic like Dungeons and Dragons, and you're going to model out the dungeon with dungeon tiles. And I've seen like, I can't fault the effort and artistry that goes into making these amazing dungeon set pieces. And the fact that a lot of them are modular, sometimes they're not. And then I'm like, okay, I hope you get a lot of use out of that. One of the issues, there's a lot of different issues with that. One, it's a little tedious to have to reach over walls. You could use flat plates, that's fine, and just have walls suggested by the limits or the edge of the tile. But also things like, I don't know if there's a role-playing equivalent for Fog of War, the unknown terrain. I've seen different ways people approach this. Sometimes they bring out each piece individually, but then you have to have a place to put all those pieces that people can't see. And I'm not saying that it's not doable, but it becomes really cumbersome. And part of what I think the immersion of role-playing is like you say, like it's kind of forgetting about the bits and trying to get into that theater of the mind and occupy that. Now, that comes with challenges too, because you're not 100% certain that the thing that you're describing is coming into the player's heads or vice versa.
Yes.
Usually with declarative statements, it works pretty well. So, I mean, if it didn't, we wouldn't have role-playing games, flat out.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's a certain kind of cumbersomeness that comes from having all of these things on the table. And while it might be impressive, I don't always find it that immersive. I do see some need for positionality, and I'm a big fan of using like flat cardboard tokens when I do this, so that, if you're capable of printing off like a cool picture, but even if you just have like some symbol that represents one player and then a bunch of other symbols that represent goblins and stuff like that are reusable, that's preferable to me, especially if you use icons, because this is a little different because of coming from the fact that we can print very specific miniatures at more and more impressive quality.
Yeah.
But I also don't really want to imagine my guy as that guy, because the character that I'm embodying is more dynamic than the frozen figure that I have on the table. So representing them in a tactical situation just by using a little token is good, because it's just a reference as to where everyone's standing and not the actual show that's happening in my mind. It's more like the mini map in like an open world game.
Oh yeah, totally.
That's how I like to think about positionality in a role-playing game, and why I personally don't like to use miniatures, because I find it, like you have said, too restrictive to the type of game that I enjoy.
I think that's absolutely a good way to put it. And like, if I was to draw a parallel to a type of like media that I feel like a role-playing game should feel like to me, it's the written word. It's like books.
Right. Yeah.
And that is the theater of the mind to me. So it's like, it's such a natural pairing. I mean, that relationship doesn't have to exist for everyone. But in my mind, when you're playing a really great RPG, it feels like you're reading a really cool book that you're like writing yourself, kind of. And having the components on the table, you know, like miniatures and terrain, and going through this, like putting down a spell template to know that I've hit these 8 squares, that I think is less, it doesn't add as much to me as having like a really cool ability to delve in on like the really narrative aspects of an encounter or a combat, for example, that you could do just in the mind's eye.
Yeah. Like, again, I don't see anything wrong with playing with miniatures for role-playing games.
Yeah.
And of course, your individual mileage may vary. There's a whole separate conversation when it comes to like VTTs and
oh yeah,
how those represent what's going on. And there's similar arguments on a almost completely different dimensional level as to like whether that's effective or not. But for me personally, yeah, I don't know that I need that. I've actually, like, I have VTTs. I've used them. I think they're helpful. They certainly help calculate certain aspects. But a lot of the time when we've been role-playing lately, I literally just have a webcam on my dice bowl, and we're just in Discord doing role-playing stuff, and maybe I'll throw an image up or something like that, and I'll roll physical dice where everyone can see them on camera.
That, for a role-playing game, feels like it covers what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're looking at a miniatures game, in contrast, I really like when I can have the models and the terrain feel really good and feel really cool to the setting. And that's again something about, we kind of brought this up at the start of the episode, but like, do you feel good, or not good, but like, you know, do you feel comfortable using a model that is so specifically one thing from another setting in this now new setting, like, right? And I think the same applies for terrain, right? If you have like, if all your terrain is covered in skulls, does it work for every setting that you want to tell a story in?
I mean, another way to look at that is a miniature game, like a miniature war game, more immersive than a hex encounter game?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
And I would say to some degree it is and it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
I think a hex encounter game takes a bit more time to kind of get into that frame of mind. But it does kind of loop back around to what the role-playing game is doing, because it's more representational.
Yeah.
And you're imagining, like, you know, if you're playing squad leader or something like that, you're imagining what, in the theater of your mind, what those troops are doing when they move from, you know, 3 hexes up to that building. It's an interesting point. But I mean, for me, I like miniatures. I like when war games have them. And not that I don't dislike hex encounter games. I probably should play more of them, but the few that I have played, I'm like, this is fun, but you really have to like settle into it.
Yeah, you got to lock in.
It's not something that you get right away. You kind of look at it and are like, wow, that looks really dry. Like as a game. And then once you start playing it and you learn the rules, you get a bit more of that.
Like in an RPG, you're right in the mind of a person.
Yeah.
And in a war game, you're at the moment of the draw of swords. But like a hex and counter game, it's like you're at the moment where you're planning for all those other things to happen. So it's this like different level of immersion. Like I think a miniature is great because it like brings you to the table and it shows you a perspective and a guy and what he looks like and where he's going.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like who is this person and who is she? Who are they? What are they up to? I love that. But in a hex and counter game, it's like you usually don't see that level of tactical representation, but you're making the decisions that lead up to it, which is also immersive in like a slightly different perspective, which I think is really cool. Like in a war game, say we're doing a battle in Normandy, you might need to know in a miniatures game who's behind what hedge and what weapons do they have. But in a hex and counter game, you might be more concerned with where's their HQ unit behind them relative to them getting orders, or where are the trucks driving to give them food and ammunition, right?
Right. Well, it becomes more strategic at that point. And then again, if you go further out from that, you end up in grand strategy.
Yeah.
Which is, well, that's about as abstract as you can get. So, yeah, again, it has to do with those, I guess it's ideal scales of perspective and like also what you intend the game to be.
Yeah.
You know, like, again, if you just want to have like a super chill dungeon romp where you're going from room to room, yeah, maybe using miniatures and dungeon terrain is good, especially if you got it.
Yeah, right.
You know, and for me, it's a lot of investment for something that's so specific. With wargaming, I can find a lot of different uses for a lot of different terrain because it's dealing with both a contained field of play and also a more organic displacement, right? Like, I obviously can move around the components within a dungeon tile, but it's more restrictive in a lot of ways. And like, oh, well, what if I want an L-shaped room that goes out like 8 squares and then turns 5, but then next time I play, I want it to be a bit shorter so I can fit something else in. Anytime that I've tried to figure it out or model it in some other way, I feel like I'm fighting with it. Unless you really enjoy making those pieces, I don't really see the point in doing it.
Yeah, it's like miniatures have a job to do, and picking the right miniatures to do that job is part of the fun. But I think miniatures can't be mistaken as being the only part of the hobby per se, because like when it comes to a miniatures game, like they're the heart and soul of it. But a role-playing game, it's the imagination. And the miniatures can augment that. And if that's what they're there to do, then that's great. But when they're like fighting for the center attention and you're seeing your actions as not through the lens of a character, but through the lens of a miniature on a board, that's getting fuzzier. And like there are actually really interesting miniature games that, like we talked about 5 Leagues, there's 5 Parsecs from Home, which is another one, that are very RPG-ish and have lots of those components to them, but they still are a miniatures game, and the grist of the game is with the miniature encounters, right? So those are games that you would want to play as a miniature game first and foremost, that have a lot of RPG elements to sell the experience, where if you're playing a role-playing game, it's almost like you want the miniatures to sell that, not compete for the center spotlight.
So that's our episode on miniatures agnostic games. Troy, maybe you want to explain what's going on for the next month.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for listening to us all throughout 2024. It's been so much fun getting this show off the ground and engaging with you guys. We're going to be taking a brief hiatus throughout the month of January as Max moves and we get some things reset. So do expect us back in the beginning of February with new content. We are going to be continuing our game reviews and book club assessment of RPGs, war games, and the occasional board game. But we're also going to really continue to dive in on and expand on our design conversations and sort of our occasionally more rambling topics.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that we just generally having more content as to how we do that. And, you know, as I already kind of mentioned earlier, I'm going to be moving, so that's also going to be a big undertaking on my part, but it's going to, in the end, offer, I hope, a better quality to the show. But I really want to know what you guys think of the show so far, and just let us know any ways that you think to improve it. Put it in the comments if there are comments, or talk amongst yourselves.
Absolutely.
now that we have a listener base that we can establish, what are you guys into, like, that we're already talking about? Like, I don't think we're ever going to turn the show into something where it's just about one game, because there's tons of shows like that.
Yeah.
I think us going through different things, we definitely want to do more current stuff, and we want to do more older things that are, orphan games and long lost treasures, and probably terrible things too. Things that just are utterly, what were they thinking?
Yep, 100%.
But maybe it's fun to kind of crack it open and see why it doesn't work.
That would be our take on miniature agnostic games and beyond. I mean, we covered a few subjects here, but I would be looking forward to coming back in February. I'm very excited for what we're going to have in 2025. So please stay tuned. Like Max said, if you have anything you want to see more of, any specific topics, themes, or conversations, just let us know. We're really open. We are having a blast working on the show, and we look forward to what we can bring in the next year.
Yeah. Until then, happy gaming and have a good one.
Have a good one.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.